What makes great art great? Is Frida Kahlo the greatest artist of all time? Why has Frida Kahlo transcended time compared to her fellow same time period Mexican artists? I mean, you know Frida, she's everywhere. But why? It took me weeks of research, but I think I found an answer. A few weeks ago, I was reading a book about art psychotherapy written by Harriet Waiteson. She was introducing it by defining terms like art and the overall idea of meaning. And she said something really interesting that I had never thought of before. She talks about how, in her point of view, what makes an artist or their art great is the meaning they pour into their art, and instead of how representative the meaning is of its time, what makes it great is how transcendent or shaking the meaning is for its context. I thought it was interesting because I always saw all kind of art as a product of their times, and she planted a seed in my head with this idea that I couldn't stop from growing. So I've decided to create a series of video essays comparing artists with the same geographic context and period of time in order to compare what made some great and lasting the test of time and what made others not. And is the meaning of their work really a factor to take into consideration? For this episode, we will start with what has been my home for the past 3.5 years now, Mexico, and two of the most famous painters, Frida Kahlo and José Clemente Orozco. Before we start, I would like to define some of the terminology so that we know what we're talking about. In Cambridge Dictionary, art is defined as the making of objects, images, music, etc. that are beautiful or that express feelings. It also can be an activity through which people express particular ideas or a skill or special ability. Now, I wanted also to see the concept or the definition of transcendence because it seems that it's what makes art great, and they define it as the experience that goes past normal limits or the ability to achieve this. For the sake of this video, we will define great art by art that has passed the test of time and is still considered one of the best nowadays. We will also include the concept of how famous the art or artist got through time. I know we can all have a different perspective on what makes art great, and that we could debate that with the time the main authority on the topic were mainly white men, so it was a greatly biased point of view on the topic. I love to dig into that topic if it interests you, but this video is going to be long enough as it is, so for the sake of my mental health, we'll debate on the topic another time. So now we will analyze the time period, the context in the country, and then both the artists' lives. As a time frame reference, we will take the date of birth of Orozco and date of death of Kahlo, so 1883 to 1954. So José Clemente was 23 years old older than Frida, but she only died 5 years after him. She died young, around 47 years old, but they did live at the same time periods. Before we start on this time period, which was really special for Mexico, we need to give context. So we'll start with a quick washout of history. Don't get mad if I don't get into all the details. We'll get deeper into the whole 19th century and then while they lived. Sounds fun? Mexico was a land divided into different populations with different cultures, languages, etc. Two most famous of them were Mayas and Mexicas. Mexicas, from whom the name Mexico comes from, and known nowadays as Aztecas. Spaniards arrived there in 1519, and in 1521 it was declared as conquered. Basically, the Mexicas were very good warriors and had enslaved a very big chunk of the country and different populations. So when Hernan Cortes, the Spaniard, arrived, he very swiftly used the hate against the Mexicas to take on the country by making alliances, which has created the most fascinating concept in Mexican culture, which we don't have the time to explain, but that I love so that I'll mention it. It's el malinchismo. Once in power, the Spanish crown proceeds to destroy the native culture and slaughter or enslave most natives, and they took many resources as gold and silver. They created a system called encomienda, which was basic slavery, but to lift up their conscience and spirits, they set it as a protection towards the weakest, which is a very religious view. Oh, and they proceeded to offer the people the choice to become Catholics or to die. This last fact is not actually proven, but it is mainly what is taught in Mexican schools. Spaniards' history tends to deny it or nuance it more, so don't get at my throat for it. Thanks. So now we fast forward to the 800s. On the 16th of September of 1810, which is nowadays the National Day, the Independence War starts. In August 1821, the first independence treaties are signed, which are known as El Tratado de Córdoba. In 1824, they had a new constitution. After that, they lost a war with the United States and were obliged to sell them land. That's right, you heard me, the states of California, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, Kansas, New Mexico, and Texas used to be Mexican. I wonder how some Americans feel about that fact. From 1833 to 1855, the country was a big mess because no one agreed on how to manage it and, more importantly, to whom should get the power. Isn't it always the same story with men? Sorry, I mean mankind. Like when men with capital M. Oh well. There's a guy called Santa Anna. Well, El General Antonio López de Santa Anna, but I don't have time, who was in charge of power several times during this instability and then decided to become its dictator in 1853, but then was kicked out 1 year later. They re-established the federal government in a period called La Reforma. They implemented a lot of economical and political reforms, freedom of industry and religion. And it was great, minus the fact that because of the shit show that lasted the first half of the century, they had too much debt with France, Spain, and England. So Benito Juárez, the president at the time, tried to negotiate. Spain and England accepted negotiation. And France was like, nope. And Napoleon III in 1864 sent Fernando Maximiliano de Habsburgo to rule. Turns out Fernando Maximiliano de Habsburgo really wanted to help the people of Mexico, but well, his faith was very different. I guess we can thank him for the Castillo de Chapultepec in Ciudad de Mexico, because it's my favorite place to visit when I go there. He was executed only 3 years later after France abandoned him, retrieving its army because it was needed somewhere else. Funny, no one ever taught me that part of history in history class in French schooling. Anyway, now one general called Porfirio Díaz does not really like Benito Juárez as president and tries to be elected but fails. When finally there was a new president, the general came back and started a dictatorship around 1876, and that ended in 1911. There was a little 3 to 4 year break between 1880 and 1884, though. Even if it's a dictatorship called El Porfiriato, the country was genuinely at peace with economic prosperity and infrastructure development, industrial modernization, and cultural and scientific rebirth thanks to foreigners' investments. Except rich people got richer and poor people were starving. And this is the context prior to our artists' lives. Kind of. So, we will start with José Clemente Orozco. I discovered when I moved in 2020 to Guadalajara, Mexico. There are 3 of his most famous works in the city, and they are all breathtaking. I remember I would go visit alone whatever place my Spanish teachers would recommend, and the first one I saw was in Musa. I didn't even know it was there, so it felt like I was one of the luckiest people to have discovered this work of art. I was in awe and literally breathless staring at it. Turns out it's what most people want to see in this museum. I just didn't know. José Clemente Orozco was born in 1883 in Zapotlan, nowadays known as Ciudad Guzman. He grew up a part of his life in Jalisco, then went to Ciudad de Mexico. There he starts taking painting night classes in Bellas Artes. His family wants him to have a proper job, so he starts university in 1897 and later will graduate as an agricultural engineer. In 1904, he lost his left hand in a gunpowder accident, which was unfortunately very common in Mexico at the time. Between 1907 and 1914, he formally began his artistic training at the Academy of San Carlos. There, he received classes from the Spanish Antonio Fabres. Shortly after, he met the Dr. Dr. ATL, whose real name is Gerardo Murillo, who guided him towards the investigation of Mexican identity. In 1922, he joined David Alfaro Siqueiros, Diego Rivera, and Rufino Tamayo, and other notable names that shaped Mexican muralism. Muralism was a movement that thought to return art to the public dimension and serve nationalism and the popular cause. In 1923, he married Margarita Valladares, with whom he had 3 children. In 1928, he went to New York, where he held the exhibition Drawings of the Revolution. After this, in 1930, he created a mural for Pomona College in California, and a year later he did another in the New School for Social Research in New York. He also traveled through Europe, where he studied the great masters of the Baroque and met avant-garde artists. In 1934, he returned to Mexico and committed himself to the defense of revolutionary values, becoming a highly valued artist. Since 1941, Orozco dedicated himself to easel painting, although he did not stop undertaking mural projects. In 1943, he participated as a founding member of the National College. He published his autobiography 2 years later, in 1945, and in it he reveals his political disappointment in general from his country. In 1946, he joined the Mural Painting Commission of the National Institute of Fine Arts, and that same year he received the National Prize of the Fine Arts of Mexico. José Clemente Orozco died in Mexico City on September 7, 1949, as a result of cardiac arrest. Throughout his life, he showed great interest in social issues, which in his first stage was expressed in the representation of the daily life and the subaltern world, bars and cabarets. His favorite topics were pre-Columbian history, the history of Mexico, and criticism of the contemporary world. He evaded the mystification of the indigenous issue by perceiving it as part of the historical conflict in Mexico. He rejected classical and avant-garde Western models and became interested in the study of indigenous aesthetics. He mainly had male characters in his work, and he used fiery coloring similar to expressionist vigor, and he preferred gigantism and monumentality in his composition. Now, I'm going to repeat myself. Orozco is extremely famous and recognized in Mexico. He was part of the social advances and supports some political and social views his fellow muralist artists shared. He denounced in his work the colonization, the religious power, representation of Mexican independence and its cost, etc. In other words, he was criticizing a reality of his country's past on which views in general were evolving, and trying to make his population advance through creating more awareness. He was extremely recognized during his lifetime, and therefore we could say was an artist of his time. He did disrupt what was known and considered as art or social views. As such, I think we can consider its art as great because it had a transcendent and shaking aspects for its context and time. Now, let's get to Frida Kahlo. Contrary to José Clemente Orozco, it is hard to find information about her work that does not entirely include her personal life. The artist and the art are inseparable, and you will understand why. I cannot remember for sure my first introduction to Frida Kahlo. She had always been there around me, as recognizable as Marilyn Monroe. No, I didn't know about her life nor work, just that she was culturally significant. It was only later, little by little, when learning about art, that I discovered her work. And I actually only discovered her life at age 21 when I moved to Mexico and decided to watch the movie to train my Spanish and learn about what makes her so special. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, I highly recommend it. I still cannot understand that it didn't have any sort of best movie recognition at the Oscar or something. But here is the story of her life, basically. Kahlo was born in 1907 in Coyoacán, Ciudad de Mexico, of an Hungarian descent, German father, and a Mexican mother of Spanish and indigenous descent. She was very close to her father, who worked as a photographer, and she regularly assisted him in his studio. In 1925, age 18, she got in a bus accident that injured her gravely and almost killed her. Throughout her life, she had more than 30 surgeries succeeding this event. Forced to stay in her bed for recovery, she started to study painting throughout the books of grandmasters and taught herself. She was painting herself a lot thanks to a mirror she asked to be placed above her bed and a bed-sized canvas stand her parents made for her. She got married to the muralist Diego Rivera in 1929, and this marks a change in her work as in her iconic Mexican traditional style. He was known to be a serial cheater who was already divorced twice and had had many children. Their relationship was very tumultuous. Funny fact, when I was visiting her house, now a museum of her life in Coyoacán, there was a picture of Rivera, who is 20 years older than her, and there was a mom that said to her teenagers, "Look, that's the pedophile." And I thought, what a good way to introduce them to this man. Anyway, the newlyweds soon moved to the United States, where Diego was commissioned to work in various cities from 1930 to 33. During this time, Frida had various miscarriages that were very traumatic to her. She lost her mom around the same time. These events drastically changed her art into something more raw and distressed. The themes talked about were rarely seen and very taboo for its time. After that, they went back to Mexico, where they lived surrounded by political figures and artists from all around the world. All their relationship was filled with infidelities from both sides, but in 1935, Rivera crossed her last limits when having an affair with her sister. They separated then. Her first exhibition was in 1938 in New York. It was such a success that she then was sent to Paris, where she got an exhibition in the Louvre. She didn't really like the intellectuals there nor the environment, even if she was really well received there too. When she came back in 39, Rivera asked for divorce. She felt betrayed and entered an artistic era in which she is now really famous for. The painting of the two Fridas represents the two sides of her identity, one European from her father, always rejected by Diego, and the other holding a portrait of him in a traditional Mexican outfit that he always accepted and loved. In 1940, her ex-husband and her reunited and moved into her childhood house, now transformed into her museum called La Casa Azul. Her health, that had always been a burden throughout her life, will now be greatly decreasing, and she'll be trying to endure the pain with a lot of drugs and alcohol during this time. From then onward, her portraits are all representing her in different styles, but always with the same straight gaze and face. In 1953, she finally got her long life dream to have her own exhibition in her country that she attended in her own bed because she could not move anymore. She died a year later in her childhood's home from pulmonary embolism. Even if, as you can see, her life was extremely interesting, tumultuous, full of passion and love of art, she was not really celebrated. Even though she got to be exhibited in Paris and had her own cover in Vogue France, the news mostly was saying Diego Rivera's wife apparently is trying to paint too. Frida's fame only appeared later in the 70s due to the feminist movements of that time, and became a huge cultural phenomenon in the late 19th to early 20s for all she represented in the queer community and feminist artists' view. Her freedom and singularity was, and still is, acclaimed, but most of all, her work keeps on touching so many people due to its rawness and how it was used as a way to express her inner struggles in her difficult health condition, as well as search for identity and freedom. Taking into consideration our first definition of the beginning of the essay, her work truly was transcendent and shaking for its context and time. Now, the question is, what differentiates them? Why does the whole entire world know Frida Kahlo and Orozco stayed in a narrow niche of Mexican art? It took me a while to try to formulate it, but I think I finally have the answer. First of all, Frida, contrary to Orozco, puts an internal meaning into her art and not external. What do I mean by that? José Clemente mainly criticized society, its roots, and the pain his country has endured due to colonization. He did it in a, at the time, pretty mainstream way for those serious socialist artists, which was by painting murals. But he never actually included himself in the narrative of his art. At best, he transferred his intellectual by sharing his ideals, which were mainly influenced by the time period and context he grew up in. So not only wasn't his work really personal, but it was a general social commentary that resonated and shaped his periods of time. But the reason he didn't last through time is mainly because the meaning he created was not deep enough. Frida painted about herself, her intricate struggles at being a woman, at the physical pain she had to endure every single day the duality between the colonizer European roots and her indigenous colonized roots, how she felt she could be loved by her husband only by silencing the first part mentioned and being free to live and free to love. These struggles of identity, of space in society, of space as a woman, the duality of who she is stuck between, where she's from and what is expected of her, are universal themes that generations after generations keep on asking themselves, trying to find meaning into their lives. The reason why Frida became greater than most artists of her time and keep on resonating with us is because she used her art trying to make sense of her reality. And I think that in the end, it's all everyone always has been looking for or trying to do, making sense or finding meaning in life. Now there's another point I'd like to highlight to confirm her greatness. At the beginning of my research, I was looking up if there is some kind of definition of great art. Some articles were defining the characteristics of great artists, and some others the ones of famous artists, but I found nothing about the definition of what makes art great. Then I started looking for books on the topic and found various answers about the problem of defining art. Then I stumbled upon a book by Harold Rosenberg called The Definition of Art that gave really interesting insights on the topic in general. He writes about the idea that the artist himself became bigger than the art, and whatever his creation is, as an expression and analysis of the worlds he lives in, therefore becomes art. The artist is described as a person of trained sensibility, a developed imagination, a capacity for expression, and deep insight into the realities of contemporary life. The artist has become too big for art. Therefore, the nature of art has become uncertain, at least ambiguous. It is hard to define work of art, but more importantly, what is not a work of art. The uncertain nature of art is not without its advantages. It leads to experiment and to constant questioning. Nothing is left of art but the fiction of the artist. However, the artist is a product. The artist does not exist except as a personification, a figure of speech that represents the sum total of art itself. I think that oddly enough, it is what became Frida. People are not inspired by her art, but by herself, her life. Her image has become bigger than her products. The greatness of her paintings comes from the troubled, heart-shattering, yet deeply human experiences she went through. And it resonates because the people know she did them as a process to search a way out of the context and reality she was living in. Public loves her more for what she represents. They identify with her suffering and use her as an inspiration to go through their own life. They even personified her as a visual figure of Mexican art when she herself was searching for her identity between two cultures, background, countries. She ended up becoming a symbol. This is how her art became great, because she was used as a symbol of which still resonates with people from all around the world. She became a symbol of herself and her art, and how each of her decisions transcended her condition. So these were my thoughts on the topic, a very long rambling about some obscure questions I ask myself from time to time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. If you liked it, make sure to like. If you have any comment, if you want to bring nuance to what I said, if you want to continue the debate, please make sure to do it in the comment section in a very respectful way. And I will see you very soon. Thank you.